Okay, cool.
Hi guys. Hi everybody. I think we're gonna wait like a few more seconds and then we'll jump in. My name is Anaka. If you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from Long Island, New York, and I'm also hosting this festival with Annika.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm from New York City, and yeah, I'm also hosting the festival.
My name is Max Halberstam. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm a senior. Okay, also, yeah, so the way that if you hadn't got the chance to attend last weekend's interview, the way we want this to go would be as much audience participation as possible. This is a great opportunity for you guys to ask questions, ask our guest Carla questions, either in chat. You can type it up in chat, or you can even unmute yourself and just ask away. So we'll give you opportunities for that. And
Or you
just
can
through
just like do it randomly in the middle of our interview. That's even better, honestly. And we prefer, I think, verbally, but if you guys don't feel comfortable doing that, like obviously the chat works fine. We can just read out your questions. But yeah, Sarah, do you want to start off with a biography of Carla?
Okay, yeah, so I just want to say again, welcome everyone. So I'm going to introduce our guest, Carla Zanoni. Carla is a poet and journalist who was born in Argentina. She was raised in New Jersey and currently lives in New York City. She graduated from Columbia University's School of General Studies and School of Journalism. And aside from being an award-winning writer, Carla is a sought-after speaker who has moderated and conducted many on-stage panels and interviews and has been featured on Fox News, C-SPAN, NBC, WNYC, and more. Until recently, Carla was TED's first head of audience development and was also the first global audience and analytics editor and Latina to be named to the masthead of the Wall Street Journal. So Carla led national and digital social strategy at DNAinfo.com in New York and Chicago and worked as an award-winning Metro reporter in the 2000s and helped launch the first newspaper dedicated to New York City politics, now called City and State. Carla recently published a collection of poetry and is currently finishing her memoir. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, TED, Modern Lost, The Common Literary Magazine, and more. In her work, she reflects her travel experience and she writes about the convergence of culture, society, journalism, and life. And on her website, she writes and shares intimate portraits of her life, grappling with grief and her intersecting cultures. So thank you so much, Carla, for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. I'm so glad to be here. I have to say, it's a surreal experience to hear someone read your bio, because it's a highlight reel. It's actually kind of like social media, right? So life doesn't always feel that way, but those are like the peaks of my life. And it's just really lovely. It's lovely to have it read. So thank you. But I wanted to just note that that experience it's a lot to receive, and also it's not completely reflective of day-to-day life. So it's interesting. My poet brain is kind of going off in that direction, thinking about it.
Thank you. I want to start off with a question I think that kind of, I know like obviously you can't encapsulate your entire life in 3 words, but but you are a mix of of Argentina, of Jersey, and of Manhattan. And although people assume Jersey and Manhattan are not that different, but they are very different. I want to ask you how these like different cultures kind of impact how you write and what you write about.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I always say, you know, I feel like my life has always been a life kind of split, living with one foot in one world and one foot in the other world. And I certainly feel that in terms of Argentina and, being an immigrant in the United States. And, I came as a baby, so you'll notice a very American accent, definitely that's been my upbringing. But throughout my entire life, I have felt this kind of pull between both poles. Some of that is language, some of that is culture, some of that is how it affects my identity in terms of gender. I think that is the most formative piece. Additionally, I've lived in Manhattan. I live in Upper Manhattan on the tippy top of the island, in a neighborhood called Inwood, right near the cloisters. And I've lived in Manhattan now for 28 years. And so, and I will just tell you, I am 49 years old. I just turned 49 last month. And so almost half of my life was spent in New Jersey. And then more than half of my life, frankly, in the city. And I can feel on a visceral level when I go to visit my family in New Jersey, just driving over the George Washington Bridge, I feel like I have left this bubble, a bubble of, way of thinking, of privilege, of life experience that is just quite different. And the moment I arrive in New Jersey, my experience of New Jersey is of, a very much more of a working class kind of experience. My brother is an auto mechanic. He's incredibly smart and can do things with cars that I can't. I don't know how to change my oil. But we have like two different ways of expressing our intellect in the world. And I find that I observe that difference, and I find myself constantly wanting to connect more deeply to find the commonalities. So I guess that's the piece that I really want to underscore, that perhaps because I've grown up with one foot in one world and one foot in the other world, that has really made me so hungry to find the commonalities, because in my experience, I have felt so much like the other in many experiences throughout my life.
Carla, one thing I admire about your writing is that, like you said, you're kind of hungry and you're active in your present experience. You write a lot on your blog about the experiences you've had, whether it's traveling, whether it's birthdays. I'm wondering what is writing for you as this outlet for kind of expressing your experience?
I feel like until I've written something, that I haven't really fully experienced the experience. So on the one hand, I try to be incredibly present. I'm a spiritual person. I try to be in the moment and experience things in that actual moment, breathing, observing, touching my hand to make sure that I remember that I'm here. Like even right now, talking to you, making sure that I'm very clear where I am in time, not thinking about 10 minutes ago, not thinking about 10 minutes from now. So that's part of the process. But then the next step, you can see my husband walking behind us. The next step is sitting down and processing, and being able to connect lots of disparate thoughts and observations and feelings that I've had, whether they're sensory or they're emotional, and trying to capture them into a space. And I find myself, that's how I live with everything. Whether it's writing a poem, whether it's writing something more long form like the memoir that I'm working on. Even on Thursday, I purposefully took the A train and the ferry to Rockaway Beach because I was convinced that Thursday was going to be the last hot day of summer. And I think I was right. We'll see. But I was taking photos. I was writing little notes on the train. I was collecting little bits and pieces throughout the entire experience. And I'll probably write something about it tomorrow. But the first thing that I did was I actually created a reel on Instagram. And I wanted to be able to capture these different moments throughout the day to tell a story. And some of that is to share that with others, for sure. But a lot of it is for me to process and create a container that can hold the entire experience. And that's how I see the world. It's at a certain point, I didn't think that that was normal to see the world this way. I've let go of whether it's normal or not. It's just how I live. And I love living that way.
And you do that through different forms. You write poetry, you write more personal like biographies. How do you understand the forms that you write?
I would say for me, poetry is pure emotion. It's just, it is abstract, it is pure emotion, it is nonlinear. And it's a way for me to tell a story truly through that, in that visceral way, through the heart. Sometimes my memoir writing, not sometimes, my memoir writing does capture that emotion, but it's processed. It's a bit more processed. It's a bit more observational. It's I try to get the emotion down on the page and then pause. And pausing can sometimes be an hour. Sometimes it's been a decade, right? I need that distance to be able to then more objectively tell the story. And then the other part of my writing, which I do far less of these days, is journalistic writing. And that is truly like, and this is part of, this might be another session for us all together, but my feeling is with journalism, I think it's important to come in first objectively and then bring the lens of emotion to the table. The problem that I have with a lot of journalism today is either it begins with emotion and never truly gets to the objectivity I'm talking about, or it is so purely trying to be objective that it's missing that kind of connection with the audience, which I think can only be created by expressing emotion.
So speaking of different kinds of form and how you bring in your personal experiences and like your poetic versus journalistic type of writing, I've heard you're writing like a memoir currently. So can you tell us a bit about your process for it, what it's about, and how you go about writing the memoir?
So I am writing a memoir about a 4-year period during my 20s when I made what I, for a long time, thought was one of the biggest mistakes of my life. And what I have come to understand is that through the journey that I took over those 4 years, that without having had that experience, I would not be the person I am today. And I would not have been able to truly regain and reclaim a sense of self-worth. I went through a very difficult childhood with a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulties in my upbringing. And I really found myself in my 20s struggling to figure out who I was, not feeling like I was a being of value. And so I write about that. And I actually started writing about this in 2023 in a writing workshop where I started writing about this as a work of fiction because I was afraid to write about this from a memoir standpoint. And you know, I put it down for many, many years. That's why I was saying to you, sometimes I do work and it needs to sit for 10 years, like that kind of thing. I let it sit for about 10 years and began writing again about 10 years ago. And through the process of that, it's really interesting, because the book that I thought that I was writing is actually, I went through a massive detour. I thought that I was writing a literary memoir, that it needed to focus on this 4-year period, that it would be a very emotional retelling of this 4-year period. And I started talking to a lot of people about this idea, and many people started directing me off on different paths. It should be more prescriptive. It should be a self-help book. It should be, you should write it as fiction. All sorts of opinions, and wonderful opinions. I don't begrudge anyone having given me those opinions. But part of my journey and part of my process was actually coming back home into myself after receiving all of that feedback, and then saying, actually, I think I knew what I wanted to do in the first place. I want to write a literary memoir. Despite what my agent tells me might sell or might not sell, what publishers have said to me, that's, I had to go through that journey to be able to say, okay, this is what I actually want to write about. And if I am true to myself in that way, then everything else will come to be in its own time.
Thank you. And you wrote a piece about Judy Blume, who is like a phenomenal like preteen writer. And talking about your memoir, I think kind of reminded me of the piece, because I think they're both trying to explore trauma, explore like teenage angst, preteen angst, and where I'm sure like your memoir is a bit later in age than I think Bloom's work is trying to aim for, like who her audience is. What do you think are these similarities, or how has Bloom impacted you and your writing, and if so, like even in your current memoir too?
Yeah. She has inspired, and she really changed my life in many ways. And it's funny to talk about Judy Blume, because we think of, I mean, now I think there's much more respect for YA, that type of writing. And that title didn't even exist when Judy Blume was, first writing. But I recall reading her work. My favorite work that she did is Tiger Eyes, which, by the way, holds up now. I reread the book 2 years ago, I think it was, and I was just stunned by how I was relating to it as an adult versus how I had related to it as a 12-year-old girl. And I think the reason it holds up is not just the beauty of the writing. The words themselves and how the sentences are strung together are beautiful, but it's the unbridled honesty, the truth that is poured into each of those pages. And that book in particular really deals with grief and really deals with trauma. So the short version is the main character's father dies while working at a grocery shop. He's shot and killed during a robbery, and her mother is struggling with her own grief and figuring out how to raise her 2 children, and they leave New Jersey and move to New Mexico. So first of all, reading it about New Mexico, I was like enthralled. I was like, what is this amazing place? Having grown up in New Jersey, New Mexico, just from a geographic standpoint, seemed so amazing to me. But there was a way that Judy speaks about grief and about like dysfunctional families, that I just could see myself And it was the first time I had ever felt like I could see myself. And so in my writing now, about my own life experience, whether it's things from my childhood, from when I was in my 20s, or even today, I just feel like I have a saying, tell the truth and tell it fast. And what that means is, you know, when we go to tell the truth, especially when there's something shameful or there's something that we feel very vulnerable about, it's just like really important to just like get it out, and all of the answers will unfold after. And that's been my experience in writing. When I'm able to be really honest for myself, to myself, and then for others, the others comes after. I find that my writing has more impact, is stronger, reaches more people, is healing, does all of those things. It's this like alchemy that is brought to the forefront. And it feels really exciting, especially in this world that we live right now. It feels harder and harder to live that way and to be in our truth without that varnish. And writing has been a vehicle for me. And if you haven't read Judy Blume, I definitely Tiger Eyes. There are many other things. And the one other thing I'll say, and I talk about it in that essay, Judy Blume is so known for her writing on sex. You know, like much is made about how she writes about sex, and that's wonderful. She went in areas that nobody had touched before. But for me, writing about grief with that kind of honesty for that audience, it was life-changing. That I didn't know anybody who wrote that way.
So more about your blog, which you mentioned, Bloom and her work, and kind of also about like grief. And so you have a blog. I think for the audience who doesn't know, it's called the M Dash. So why were you inspired to start one, and does this content coincide with your memoir partially even? And what's the reasoning behind that title? The M Dash.
Well, I'll start with that. The M dash, first of all, is one of my favorite pieces of punctuation. But I am definitely a poet. My personality, if I never wrote a word again in my life, I could still say to you, I am a poet. And some of that really hinges on that M dash. I will start telling you a story, maybe some of the stories I just told you. I'll start telling you a story, and then I'm like, and also I need to tell you these 5 other things that are they're definitely connected, but they're not linear. And so I love the tool of the M dash to be able to go off in an orderly fashion. And that's really what I try to do in my blog, my newsletter. I want to be able to express the fullness of what's happening in my life, with the things that I'm observing, what is going on, and those things, and out of the constraints of having to be incredibly linear. So that might mean that I explore one topic that's different from the following week. It may be that in an essay, I start describing one thing, we go on a journey together, and then hopefully I do a good job of making it, wrapping it up and making it make sense for you. Or maybe I say, this is still in process, and together we're going to figure out what this means. I started it at the end of 2019, actually like the very end of 2019. And my intention was for it to be a vehicle for my memoir, and for my professional career. And unfortunately, at the beginning of January of 2020, my brother passed away suddenly in an accident. And that took over. Writing about that, the blog really became a space for me to talk about that openly, to process what was happening, and to be really in communion and connection with my audience. And you know, as we all know, so that happened January 3rd of 2020. 3 months later, we have lockdown begin. And so we went from, you know, I went from a space of familial grief to a space of communal and grief and trauma across the board. And so this really became a space where I was very committed to being as honest as possible about what was going on. And I had so much anxiety and nervousness about doing so. But what I found was the more honest I was about what was going on, the more people were signing up for my newsletter, the more people were responding, the more feedback I was getting, the more of an organic, engaged audience I had. I mean, if you go and you look at my first newsletter, like, it was kind of funny. I was like kind of mimicking what other people had done. I had like recommendations at the bottom of the newsletter, and I love doing all of those things, but that's not unique to me, right? What's unique to me is my lived experience and my ability to communicate it there. So that's really what that newsletter is. And I think as I get closer to publishing my memoir, it will probably intersect much more with the memoir.
Jason has a question he just asked in the chat. He says, you talked about preparing details about what was hopefully the last hot day of summer for a piece for writing later. And is this preparation typical of your writing process, or does it also operate instinctually?
That's such a good question, Jason. I'm definitely a collector of notes, of images, of things every single day. So, I mean, if I could move the camera, I would show you my stacks of notebooks. It's a little out of control, but I'm constantly just taking notes and collecting things. And that definitely is part of just the way that I process the world. But there is something instinctual that kicks in. So when I was in Ozone Park on the A train and had been on the train forever, it felt like, going out to the Rockaways, I was on the train station waiting to transfer, and I started feeling this feeling in my stomach. There was so much humanity. School had just let out. So there were like so many people on the platform, such a mix of humanity, like in the way that Queens is like the most amazing mix of humanity. And I felt so inspired. And in that moment, I was like, oh, I'm going to write about this. I'll just preview it. Like, I missed New York. I had just come back from Paris. I split my time between Manhattan and the Catskills. So I spent a lot of time in nature, and I spent a lot of time in the city. I was just in Paris, and I went on this trip. I could have driven to the beach. It would have been easier. It's a 45-minute ride. Like, taking the train, the ferry, everything. It's like a 2-hour experience. But I had gone on this because I wanted to feel a connection with the city. And so, to your specific question, Jason, like, I'm constantly collecting these things because I trust that inspiration is going to strike, and I prepare for that. So sometimes, you know, it could have been that I took all these notes and really I didn't have an interesting experience and I do nothing with it. Or it could be that I'm standing on the A train in Ozone Park, and I'm so filled with love and like I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it, like love and excitement and compassion for this city. And I'm like, oh my God, I have to write about that. But I've done the work to prepare to be able to do that. And like sometimes that just means making sure that my phone is fully charged so that I can like dictate a bunch of stuff into my notes app, or that I have a pen and a piece of paper in my bag so I can just take some notes. Like that's like how tangible preparation can be. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just building the skill of collecting those thoughts, those experiences, so that you're then ready when it comes.
So I can really relate to that. Like my notes app is a huge mess. But you talk a lot about taking your own experiences and like jotting it down and like encapsulating these feelings. So we have another question from the chat. So Kate's question, she would love to hear more about literary memoir as a genre and what makes memoir literary and how that helps you process your own experience.
Great. So literary memoir, the way that I think about it is, so first of all, obviously you have biographies, right? And biographies are like typically very linear storytelling that are detailing every single stop in a life. Autobiography is similar, just rather than writing about someone else, you're writing about yourself. And it's very much like when I see somebody famous who puts out, things are changing a bit now, but for the most part in the past, memoirs of famous people were much more autobiographical, right? Then you have memoir that is more intended to provide lessons, direct lessons, and they're very actionable. Many of them can fall into a self-help category. They're very prescriptive. A lot of those memoirs, like you'll have a lovely story about someone, and then at the end, they'll give you like a checklist to follow and ask yourself these same questions. I think those memoirs are wonderful. To me, the idea of writing something like that makes my skin crawl. Like it's just, I love that other people are writing that. That's not for me. What I wanted to do, and what literary memoir is for me, is to be able to write something that has more of a flow, that is a bit more abstract, that reads a bit more like fiction, that can be a bit more poetic, and doesn't have to be linear. And that calls to me for the project I'm working on now. But the truth is, I'm writing about this 4-year period of this huge thing that happened in my life. And I'm sorry to be so opaque, but I'm still in the process around that. So I'll have to come back next year and tell you much more about the specifics of the book. But for me, that's what works. I know that I can also write a book about navigating the workplace and tell you a bunch of stories about my life in a much more prescriptive way, and talk to you about how I've managed teams, of many people, and how I get them to work together, and what it took for me to get to know myself to be able to be a leader of that type. And that a different format would be right for that. So I think it's really important to not pigeonhole ourselves, and to be able to say there are different times of our lives, different eras of our lives, different stories we want to tell, and different formats might fit the best way.
Thank you. And so about flow. So I think one thing that can either hinder flow or strengthen it is two different languages kind of combining or like intersecting. And you write like sometimes in Castellano, as well as English. And as someone whose parents spoke Hindi in the house, and I kind of like think partially in Hindi, I know that I like it kind of alters how I see the world or how I interact with the world. I was wondering how you like see like being bilingual as a either as a pro or con when it comes to writing and to the process.
I would say 99.9% I see it as a pro. The tiny downside is, despite having grown up here, I still get sayings wrong all the time. All the time. And it's that kind of like, it's my parents didn't teach me those sayings correct. Yeah, either they didn't teach them to me or they taught them incorrectly. So I always have this sense of, like, I joke around saying English is my second language, which is clearly, it is not my second language. Or it is my primary language, I should say. But I sometimes feel like I need to apologize for not being able to remember these different sayings. That's the one area that I sometimes feel hindered. And I felt that way particularly in the professional space, because that kind of shorthand is currency. So that has always been a challenge. That's the only place I feel that it's been a hindrance. Without even knowing it, my poetry is so incredibly influenced by my ability to speak Castellano. It's Spanish. It's a specific dialect of Spanish in Argentina that's very influenced by Italian, because so many people in Argentina, so much of the culture is made up of Spanish and Italian immigrants. And my family is from Spain and from Italy originally. And that kind of like Italianate sing-songiness rhythm is definitely part of how I write. And it's so I'm not even conscious of it. Sometimes I'll read something, to a writer's group and they say, wow, the lyricism, the flow of the words. I wasn't even aware of it as I'm writing it. So all to say, it's not even something that I'm consciously putting into place. It's just part of my DNA. And just one note, I spoke only Spanish until I was about 4 years old. Even when we came to the US, my family spoke a lot of Spanish at home. And when I was 5, I went to kindergarten. That's when I started speaking English. And Spanish kind of slipped away in my household for many years. My father, and we could debate whether this is right or wrong, but my father was really dead set on ensuring that we assimilated. And he wanted to make sure that we had as many opportunities as possible. So I understand why he wanted that. My parents divorced when I was 9, and my grandmother moved in with us. And I spent a tremendous amount of time with my grandmother. I, had 2 brothers, twins, and they would spend a lot of time with each other. And I would spend, as the only girl, would spend a lot of time with my grandmother. And that's where I started speaking much more Spanish and reconnecting. So on the one hand, it was so amazing to have these 4 years of solid foundation of speaking Spanish, but it went away for, like another 5 years and then came back. And during that time, so I think the foundation taught me that flow and lyricism. And then the time with my grandmother really was much more grammar and vocabulary and having more of a command from that perspective. And then many years later in college, I studied Spanish to really be able to understand grammar, to really be able to write. And it's a continued practice.
Yeah, I can definitely connect to that as someone whose like father like speaks French and German. I've also like tried to learn these languages to communicate with my grandmother because she's quite old and she has a bit of a hard time understanding English. So I definitely have learned languages to try to connect with other people. But Sage had a question in the chat. Do you find yourself being inspired by other visual arts the same way you do with written word? And have you ever considered combining the two?
The answer is definitely yes, that I feel incredibly inspired by other visual formats. I so wish that I was talented in painting. Like I love it. I am so moved by that expression. And I often find myself frustrated that I can't bring to life the idea in my brain onto the page. So that's one area where I would love to be able to learn more. I've thought about taking classes just to be able to have a bit more of a command to express myself that way. I am a potter. I haven't in a while, but I work in ceramics and pottery, and actually won some awards when I was in high school for my pottery. I love that expression. Like a piece of pottery can make me cry. There was this amazing exhibition at the Museum of Natural, no, at the Met, and it was really focusing on enslaved people who had created pottery in the Carolinas. And there were these enormous pots, huge scale pots. Maybe after I'll send a link to this to Anaka. But I remember, so two things. First of all, I remember looking at the pots and the scale was tremendous. And you could see the fingerprints in all of the work forming it. And in addition to that, the people who had worked on these pots had written snippets of memoir and snippets of poetry. And the joining of those two things, oh, I have goosebumps again. It's a good, energetic morning. Looking at that, I felt like, wow, I had never even thought to give myself permission to join those two pieces together. And I think our work as writers can only be heightened and amplified by joining those different formats. They're all just communication tools.
So, as part of your identity, like aside from being just a writer, you also manage teams and you conduct interviews just like we are doing now, and you have so many other aspects of your life. So, can you talk a bit about those other work experiences and how it impacts your writing?
First of all, you're all doing a very good job at interviewing, so take it from me. Well, that's the first thing that I'll say. The interviewing piece, just like what I was saying about collecting little notes and collecting experiences and processing, speaking to others and helping someone pull their story out, possibly in a way that they've never even thought of before or have communicated before, and listening, like truly listening, which is a skill and one that I'm working on every day. I'm not perfect at it. That is so not just complementary to my writing, but necessary to the writing. So that's a really important piece for me. And I genuinely love moderating panels, interviewing people. It's one of the things that lights me up the most in life. I joke around that I'm just a nosy person, and that's why I became a journalist. But it's true. I'm just like very curious about people. I just want to know what makes them tick, what what do they have for breakfast? Like, I want to know all of the things, the mundane to the extraordinary. And similar to that experience, I love managing people, and I've been incredibly blessed. I think I shared earlier that I'm 49. I am firmly Gen X, whatever that means. I want to put like an asterisk next to all of anything that I say about generations, because I have many thoughts about all of this, but I think it's like too convenient to just lump us into these categories. I want to find the connections more than the things that differentiate us. But I've led teams that have worked on emerging media, on social media, on digital, like all of these, like now they're not new, but at that time when I started, these were like new formats, new ways of communicating. And quite often that meant that I was managing teams who are younger than me. And the reciprocity that goes into that, where I've been able to mentor and provide my perspective, my lived experience, to these teams. But I would say almost more importantly, what they have shared with me and what I have gained in understanding of their lived experience of how our culture is changing, how viewpoints are changing and evolving. I am so much richer for that. And specifically writing my memoir, it's been really interesting. Like I'm writing a book about self-worth. I'm writing a book about being in my 20s and even later and struggling with a belief in my self-worth. Managing young teams, this is a topic that has come up over and over and over again. And my understanding of myself through the lens of managing them has been transformational, validating, helpful. I have managed people who really did not struggle with a sense of self-worth. And that was helpful to be able to better understand my experience, to better understand, can everybody see my dog? Her name is Gertrude Stein. So I actually feel like she was really important to show up on the screen. So I think for a long time, I thought that my work life and my writing life were completely divorced from each other. And I needed to like close one notebook and open up the laptop or whatever to switch gears. And at this point in my life, I actually see how they are so intertwined, and my life is better for it.
Thank you so much. I think before we ask the audience if they have any last questions, I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give to any of us in the audience or any of us here about like as a young writer for the future as you've had your 49-year writing career?
I think when I was younger, I definitely felt like I didn't have clear answers about what I was supposed to do or what direction I was supposed to go in. And maybe I knew and maybe I didn't. But what I think is the most important thing that I want to impart is that the belief that there is only one path or that there is only one correct way forward, that belief is flawed. The flaw is not in, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. It's the very first thought that there is one right answer. Life to me is this amazing tangle of experiences, and our work is to allow ourselves to experience that tangle and to be in the space of to be here now. to really be here in the moment and to experience what is happening, and to have the hope and faith that that tangle of experiences is going to lead you in the right direction. So that foundational belief, I think, is really important to ponder. The second thing, like I said earlier, tell the truth and tell it fast. And here's the thing, what I don't mean is, we have this, like, it's a dual epidemic. On the one hand, we have people who are just like spilling their guts on social media and like trauma sharing and like doing all of these things nonstop in a way that doesn't feel really formed, and oftentimes can be a way of getting attention or wanting validation. I totally get the impulse. But pausing a bit and thinking about the right audience, the right trusted space, the right way that you want to communicate is really important. So on the one hand, you want to tell the truth and tell it fast, but being very selective about where you're doing that and how you're doing that, I think is really important. So an example would be, I found myself kind of pouring my soul out in Instagram posts. This is like maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It's not even that long ago. And I said to myself, well, why am I doing that? Like, am I doing that because I want likes? Am I doing that because I want attention? Because I feel lonely? Like, whatever the feelings were, or feeling insecure and I want validation. So I said to myself, okay, like, what are the rings of expression and distribution, right? Like, maybe the first is my journal. And then the next ring is like actually writing a poem or writing an essay or doing things like that. And then I have a trusted group, which I get the sense, this group might be a space for all of you to be able to do that, to be able to share your writing in a little bit of a raw form, getting the kind of feedback, positive feedback, that inspires you to keep moving forward and to keep expressing yourself this way. That's incredibly important. And then the next step is like deciding how public you want to go with any of that. But there needs to be discernment and discipline in that process. Otherwise, frankly, it can lead to a lot of self-harm. So I think that's, and then the last piece I'll say is like, always be collecting. You just don't know, like, keep your notes section. And I know it feels like the notes section, Sarah, is like messy or whatever, but you can go back and clean it up. Like, you can Marie Kondo that, like, it doesn't, or Marie Kondo, whatever her name is. It doesn't matter. Just like collect all of this stuff, because later on, you'll more than likely have an opportunity to go back and make sense of it and make it into something else. Those practices, I think, are really important. I have like 9 million other things I want to tell all of you, but I'll stop with that.
Thanks so much. So I guess we're going to transition into our period where we're letting the audience speak up now.
Great.
So I guess if there's any lasting questions from the interview, feel free to unmute yourself or put the question in chat. Yeah.
So we do currently have one question in the chat we haven't answered. So Toby says, our surroundings often shape our experiences. Where do you write, and are there particular locations or settings you return to?
I write right here. I'm in the second bedroom in my apartment. And I tend to write at my desk here, but I write everywhere. Like, I'm really serious about the notes section. Like, there are times where I'm in the shower and like the first sentence of a poem will come into my head, and I, like, with a wet hand, reach out, grab my phone, dictate it into the phone. Like, I'm like a crazy person. I have to capture it because I know if I don't grab that sentence, it's gone. You know, I keep a notebook next to my bed, same thing. I'm falling asleep. So an idea or a sentence or a word comes to mind. The times when I haven't written them down and I thought, oh, I'll remember. Right. I'll remember that chapter or this story should go before this story, or I'll remember tomorrow morning. I never remember tomorrow morning. So, so I write everywhere. The other place, I like writing in cafes, with headphones on. I like the din, like the white noise or the brown noise of people moving around me, but I don't want to hear their words. That's a big thing. When I write, I know this isn't exactly your question, but it's related to it. When I write, I only listen to music without words. I can't listen to music with words. It's too distracting. And then the other weird place where I write is I love writing on trains. There is nothing better. It's like I get on the train, the movement, and it can be the subway or it can be a regular train. The movement, that rhythm, like it's particularly poems, pour out of me. It's like this like faucet just turned on. So anytime I feel like a sense of being blocked, and we could talk much more, I don't believe in writer's block. I believe there are different seasons to our writing. And sometimes we're in a season of collecting, sometimes we're in a season of output. But anytime when I'm like on a deadline and I don't have the privilege of being in a season of collecting, like I'll get on something where I'm moving, and that's helpful.
Thank you. I will say that at least during COVID for me, I like to like press record and go on walks and just talk to myself, which I know it sounds crazy, but I think it works. So I want to thank you, Carla, for coming, and I think we don't have any more questions from the audience. And so I want to thank you for coming and for sharing your story and your advice. Tomorrow we have Emma Straub, who's coming at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I want to invite everybody, if you have time, to come. It's the same Zoom link. So yeah, hopefully I'll
Thank
see
you
you all
so
tomorrow.
much.
And
It was
thank you, Carla.
amazing. Thank you, everyone. And Anaka, I'd be happy to share my email with the group if anybody ever has any questions. I genuinely mean that. If along your writing process, if you have questions or want thoughts, I'm completely open. And this was just such a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Bye, everyone.